Well, I'm going to introduce Dave. Dave Schroeder is our main event tonight. Dave is the executive director of the Kenton County Public Library, and he lives here in Ludlow. He grew up in Ludlow, still lives here. And a couple comments about Dave is that he works at the library now as the executive director, but I saw in his bio that he started out as a shelver. So started off at the foundation and worked up. So Dave began his career at Kenton County Public Library in '86 as a shelver. In '87, he began working in the local history department, indexing historic newspapers. He held the position as archivist for Thomas More College in the Diocese of Covington from 1996 to 2000. And Dave returned to the Kenton County Public Library in 2000 as the Kentucky History Librarian. He serves as president of the board of the Friends of the Kentucky Public Archives and was appointed a member of the Kentucky Archives and Records Commission by Governor Ernie Fletcher in 2007. And he's also a member of the Telecommunications Board of Northern Kentucky. What is not on his bio yet is that he's also the vice president of the Ludlow Heritage Museum. That museum is right down the road here, and it is a great museum of Ludlow artifacts and genealogy. If you haven't seen it, I'll recommend that you go see it. It's a great treasure again that we have in Ludlow, and we try to support that museum as often as we can at any events we are to promote it. Dave's vice president and should take it on to bigger and better things. So with that, introduce Dave, one of our best ambassadors of Ludlow.
How is everybody tonight? Good. They always told you never to follow children or animals. I've never followed a circus act, but it's going to be hard to top. But I will do my best. Everybody can hear from back in the back? Okay, if you can't, just raise your hand. And I'm having trouble seeing you from the light, but if you're having trouble hearing me, raise your hand. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Ludlow Lagoon Amusement Park. Who knows anything about the lagoon? Okay, very good. I can tell you as a kid, we were all over that property. Spent a lot of time down there, and we're going to see some things that still remain and see a lot of things that are gone. This is a picture of the amusement park when it was in its heyday. And to give you an idea of basically where it was, this is the entryway, which is on Laurel Street between Park and Deverell. So if you know where Laurel Street between Park and Deverell is, that is where that is located. And if you look on the hill right here, anybody know what that is on the hill? The old St. Boniface Church. So you're looking in that direction. So that's pretty much where you are. If you were looking about right here, beyond this photograph would be the trestle that goes over Sleepy Hollow Road. So that's approximately where it is. When they show you the map, which is really cool, by the way, I can't wait to see it myself. I've seen parts of it. It's really interesting. Why an amusement park in Ludlow? What street are we looking at right now? This is 1894. What street? Elm. And what's running down the middle of it? Streetcar tracks. Highway Avenue was constructed through Ludlow and opened in September of 1894. How did you get to Covington before then? River Road, which is still partially there. It doesn't connect through anymore, but that's the way you used to get to Covington. In 1894, they built the highway. We just call it the highway in Ludlow, right? People say, where's Ludlow Highway? And I just say the highway. But the streetcar company, the owners of the streetcar company were actually the financial backers behind the lagoon. Why do you think that is the case? What was at the end of the Fort Thomas streetcar line? The fort. What was at the end of Rosedale? The Rosedale line. Rosedale Park. What was the end of the Bellevue-Dayton line? Tacoma. They wanted something at the end of the Ludlow line because they wanted to get ridership going to Ludlow, not just people going back and forth to work, but they wanted to get other people coming down using that line. And so you see the streetcar line was put through by the owners of the streetcar company as a way to make money. And so the earliest owners of the amusement park were also involved with that streetcar company. This is a picture of the city of West Covington and the city of Ludlow and the city of Bromley in 1883. You'll see Ludlow pretty much ends at Adelia Street or Adela Street. If anybody says Adela, they're not really from Ludlow, right? Although it's spelled Adela. You'll see here, this creek running through is Pleasant Run. It's called the Pleasant Run Creek. It still runs through the property today. The idea was, in 1884, we had one of the largest floods up till that time, and water backed up from the river into that valley, and it formed a temporary lake. And so J.J. Weaver, who was the city engineer of Ludlow, saw that lake and saw money. So he approached the members of the streetcar line and said, this is a great place to put an amusement park. So look at you'll see the creek emptying out right between Ludlow and Bromley there. By the way, there was a toll bridge over that stream. You had to pay to get to Bromley, or if you wanted to go from Bromley to Ludlow, you had to pay. This is a little bit later. You'll see the streetcar track is the dark line, so it's following the new Highway Avenue. It's coming down Elm. It's making the corner. Where did it make the corner? Right by Bullock Funeral Home, where that odd-shaped building is there. The wedge-shaped building. It crossed over there, went into Oak, came down, made a loop down Park, went to the entrance, made a loop back, and went back. And so that's how they were getting people to the park. So you'll see Park Avenue in particular developed in the West End much earlier than, say, Stokesay, Deverell, Ludford. Those came a little bit later. But you'll see how large the lake was at that time. This is about 1915. And so the lake was about 85 acres. It was anywhere from 5 feet deep to as much as 25 feet deep. So it was a very large lake. Many of the accounts say that there were 5 islands on the lake. I've never seen a map that shows any islands, so I'm not sure if there ever were islands. There is a photograph of at least one of those islands, so I'm assuming there was at least one. Could have been 2. There was also a Ferris wheel believed to be on one of those. The lagoon really got a lot of its enthusiasm from the Columbian Exposition, which was basically the World's Fair of 1893. And we know that J.J. Weaver, the founder and the first general manager of the lagoon, went to the Columbian Exposition. It was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus arriving in the New World, and it was celebrated a year late, so it was in 1893. But it was called the Great White City. Has anybody heard of the Great White City? Has anybody read Devil in the White City? Really interesting book. It talks about how the fair was started and how that city was developed on Lake Michigan in Chicago. And it also talks about a series of murders that were going on at the same time, so it goes back and forth. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it. But a number of the investors we know went to the fair. It was basically built all with classical buildings, and it was all white. Every building on the complex had to be white. And the architects were major architects from around the United States that were brought to Chicago to build the Great White City. One of the things that they came up with to make money was the Midway. It was kind of a new development, and it was an area put aside from the exhibit halls, and it was where you would find the ring toss, where you would find the oddity hall, where you would find all of those kind of things we associate with fairs. This was something new at the World's Fairs that had been going on for a number of years, and we're going to see that develop at the Ludlow Lagoon. So at the Lagoon, it had traditional boating, it had the midway, it had rides. We're going to talk about all those things. One thing I like to point out is the architect for most of the main buildings was John Boll, B-O-L-L. You will find many of his buildings in Ludlow. He was a prolific architect in northern Kentucky. Probably his largest building still standing in town is St. Boniface Church at Adelia Church, although it was primarily destroyed by the 1915 tornado, but it was rebuilt. He's also known for building the Carnegie Library, so the first library on Scott Street that's now called the Carnegie. He was the architect of that building as well, but many others in northern Kentucky, and I know Patrick Snaden has been doing some research on him and finding lots of his designs throughout northern Kentucky. So here we are at its heyday. You'll see the lake was a huge attraction. It was only open in the summer, so they took advantage of the lake. Of course, this is before air conditioning. It opened May 18th, 1895. So this is the start of the actual amusement park. The lake had opened the year before for boating and swimming. 1895 is the year it actually opens as an amusement park. You'll see some of the major buildings here. The building here is the boathouse. Right beyond it is a bathing beach. This is the dance hall. This is a ride we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Several other rides over there we're going to talk about. You'll see one of the steam launches on the lake. There were numerous boats, some steam-powered, some canoes, a number of different kinds of boats on the lake throughout its history. And there were several drownings as well. One thing we don't usually hear about at the Lagoon, there were at least 15 deaths at the Lagoon when it was open from 1895 through 1918. Some were drownings. 10 were from one particular event we're going to talk about in a minute. Just to show you a few things, the top picture there is the back of the clubhouse. That was facing the lake. Still there at the corner of Lake and Laurel, and it's being slowly renovated back to what it once was. The bottom corner is the original front entryway. So you'll see they did put a lot of money into this property. It was a major attraction in Greater Cincinnati. In the summer, on warm days, there was a streetcar that left Fountain Square every 5 minutes, heading for the Lagoon. We do know that at times there were up to 25,000 to 30,000 people there on any given night. It was drawing huge numbers, and it was outside of the city of Ludlow. I know there's probably a councilman or a former council person in here. One of the things the city wanted to do for many years was to annex the Lagoon. Why? They wanted to tax something. Beer revenue. They eventually annexed the property, but after the park was closed. You'll see the boathouse, which was very popular. That's at the top picture. There were, again, many boats that were bought from the Columbian Exposition. They were bought after the Columbian Exposition closed in Chicago and brought to Ludlow. The bottom part shows the bathing beach, which doesn't look like a whole lot of a beach to me, but if you're hot and it's in the middle of the summer and you could get in the water, it was, I'm sure, a good relief. You can see in the background the hill there that's going up towards Devou Park. So we're in this picture, we're looking towards Devou Park on the bottom there. These color pictures are actually hand-painted postcards. So the original postcards taken as photographs and then hand-tinted by an artist and sold, most of them actually at the Lagoon. It's a close-up of the boathouse, and you'll see the different kinds of boats. One of the more notorious drownings was a couple who was out on the water. The boat tipped over. The woman was completely soaked, and in those days, of course, they were wearing multiple layers of clothing. She was dragged under and drowned. The man went in after her. He was also drowned. It was a shock to the city of Ludlow because these two people had drowned, but also because they were both married to other people. I don't know if the widow and the widower ever got together, but I'm sure if they did, they had some stories to tell. This is another one of those electric launches, which were very large. Again, the lake was a huge attraction at the lagoon. We tend to focus on the rides, but the lake was something that really drew people, again, because of the weather and because of the lack of air conditioning. The lake was very popular. You'll see in the back there the old trestle. That was the original trestle. It's since been replaced. That was a single-track trestle that now has been replaced by a double-track trestle. You'll see the scenic railway, which we'll talk about in a minute, running. That's the undulating track here. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a couple of other interesting things going on at the lagoon. The top picture is a gold mine. They were kind of trying to recreate the gold rush, and they built a miniature gold mine in the side of the hill, and you could actually go into the side of the hill on a cart, on a rail cart, and go into what would be considered a gold mine. It was kind of a curiosity ride, and in Victorian days, you could sit with a person of the opposite sex in the same car in the dark, so it had that appeal as well. The bottom is there was a pony track at the, what would be right now, about where Deverell Street meets Lake, where Lake turns into Deverell. At the bottom of the hill there was a pony track, but you'll see not only are there ponies, there's miniature ponies. Can everybody see that? It's a goat. So it's a goat pulling a cart. So there are all kinds of activities going on, and you'll see people are fairly well dressed at this time when you think about it. We got long sleeve shirts on, the boys wearing a coat, the guys wearing a vest. Of course, everybody's got their hats on. This is the merry-go-round, which was one of the first in our area, and it was one of the first to be powered by electricity. The sign actually says electric merry-go-round right over the door. It's a little hard to see probably from where you are. The original lighting in the park was gas, but was turned into electricity. The park owners were very progressive for the time period, and we'll see lots of things happening at the park that they kind of took advantage of the latest technology. For instance, we're standing in a theater. This was not the first theater in Ludlow by any means. There was one right across the street that predated this one. The first actual moving picture theater show in Ludlow was at the Lagoon, and there was a large theater at the Lagoon for vaudeville, but also for moving pictures. This is the inside of the merry-go-round. I've tried to do some research on what happened to it. I don't know. If anybody has any information on what happened to the merry-go-round, I'd love to know. Somebody in the back? Okay. I do know that many of the first original rides were purchased from Chester Park, which was actually in what today would be the Peaselburg neighborhood of Covington. There's a little park there called Chester Park. It shut down. The Lagoon bought those and brought them to Ludlow, and that became the nucleus of the first rides. This is a miniature railroad that ran around the lake. This woman here had to have been one of the owner's wives or daughters or something, because she is in about a half a dozen pictures I've seen of the Lagoon. Somehow she's related to somebody. But you can see behind it, you can see the scenic railroad, and if you look close, you can see the cars with the people sitting on it. We would call that a roller coaster today. It was built in 1895, so it was built when the park opened as an amusement park. It was the main attraction. There was a gentleman named Lamar Thompson that kind of invented the idea of a roller coaster in the early 1890s. He originally developed a switchback railroad where you were taken by gravity down one side, you got to the end, you got off the car and got on another car, and it brought you back. He developed what was called the Scenic Railway at Coney Island in New York. This was probably the second or third scenic railway built in the country at the Lagoon. So again, very progressive. They were spending a lot of money to really build the park. The innovation here was you would start high So you would start at a tower at this end. Gravity would take you down. See the building at the end? It's actually over the lake. So you're going over the lake. The building at the end is built on piers above the lake. You went into that tower. You went around in a circle, in a corkscrew, shot out the other side by gravity, and were pushed back in the other direction. So it was all gravity fed originally, and then it became steam powered. So when it became steam powered, it became even more popular. But it was a very short ride when you look at it, but it was extremely popular. Remember, this is before cars. This kind of ride would have been extremely unusual in this part of the country. And it drew thousands of people every day to the lagoon just to ride this ride. By the way, you paid an entrance fee at the lagoon at the very beginning, and then you paid for each additional thing that you wanted to experience. So if you wanted to go on the scenic railway, you paid a little bit extra to go. Eventually, they paid one fee like at Kings Island where you pay and you got to do everything. But at the beginning, it was whatever you wanted to do, you paid a little bit extra for. It's another good view of the scenic railway, and you can see the one route going this way. At this end, you would go into the building, and then you would shoot out and come back the other, and you can see the cars making their descent right here. And then you can see the old trestle in the background. Again, very popular ride. This thing drew people from all over the Midwest. And when we look at what happened with one of the great tragedies in the area at the lagoon, we'll see how many people were actually from Ohio that were coming to the lagoon. It was drawing large numbers of people, not just from northern Kentucky, but from throughout the region. This is the chutes, they called it. It was invented by Paul Boynton, who was also built the first one at Coney Island in New York. It was so successful that he started trying to sell them throughout the country. The lagoon was one of 5 places in the world that had this ride. Again, it was gravity fed. The boat would be pulled up on one side on a chain. You would get up to the top, the people would get on, and then you would just slide down in a boat. So you would slide down that route. Right before you hit the water, it hit a little hill. So you would skip up this hill and then skip across the water. They would then pull you back, pull you up back up the hill, and you'd start again. The problem was the little tilt at the end made it very dangerous. Lots of accidents on this ride. You'll see in many pictures it's there. A couple of years later, it's gone. It became a liability, and so they got rid of it. They spent thousands of dollars to build this thing, by the way. What was the ride at Kings Island that never quite made it? The Bat. It reminds me of the Bat. It was an experimental thing that never worked. And so it was eventually taken down. But what is this ride the forerunner of now if you go to an amusement park? Log flumes. So if you think of a log flume today, this is kind of the precursor of a log flume. Paul Boynton, who invented this particular ride, also did water shows, he and his wife. And they did many seasons at the lagoon. They would climb a platform that was up to 80 feet high and do dives into the water. One of his troupe actually did one of those dives in the late 1890s, hit the water at a weird angle and drowned. His wife was at the bottom kind of playing the part. They always played the part where he would hit the water, he would act like he had drowned, and then he would pop back up and everything would be fine. Well, he didn't pop back up. And the newspaper articles kept saying they put him over the barrel. And so I'm thinking, what are they talking about? They put him over the barrel. Well, in those days, they would actually, if there was a barrel around, they'd put the barrel on its side. If you had drowned, they would roll you on the barrel trying to get the water out of your lungs. So if you ever hear rolling over the barrel, that's what they were talking about. Balloons were a big thing at the turn of the century, and Ludlow Lagoon also benefited from that. Several hot air balloons were purchased, and you could take rides. We have some wonderful photographs of northern Kentucky taken from these balloons from 25, 30, 40, 50 feet off the ground. Some of Ludlow Most of the rides went west, so we have some really good ones of rural Villa Hills, rural Crescent Springs area. There's another one high above the scenic railroad you see right there at the bottom, and the trestle again at the top. The Midway. We're not at Circus Mojo for nothing. This talk really does tie into what's going on here. The performing arts were a part of what was going on at the Midway at the Lagoon. You know, they had the food, of course. Anybody know what they're doing? Look what's in their hands. They're long sticks and there's rings on them. See those individual rings? It's a ring toss. There was a Midway that ran behind the lagoon, that ran almost the entire length of the lagoon, that had everything from ring toss. They had an Edisonia display, meaning that they had about 50 inventions that Edison had developed. And they were on display, and that you could actually go in and see the new things that Thomas Edison had developed. You had a question?
Yeah, what are they tossing for soda pop? What are they tossing?
I don't know. I can't tell what they're throwing the rings at.
I know what they are.
What are they?
They're knives.
They're knives. Yes, they are knives. You're right.
Knife scabbards. And back in the day, kids would just go down and ring toss, and then they'd get a knife. How about that?
And you know what's right here?
What's that?
A gun. There's one there too. So I guess you could win a gun or a knife. Very cool. But this all developed out of what was going on at the World Columbian Exposition. It's kind of started there, and the Lagoon saw the huge amounts of money that was being made there, and so they decided to do the same thing here. Another thing they did, they started what was called Fair Japan. When Russia went to war with Japan, everything Japanese became really popular in the United States. And so they built this tea house. They brought geisha girls from Tokyo. They actually brought them into the Lagoon each summer, usually about 5 to 6 of them, who served tea. They also brought in Japanese porcelains and other prizes and things that you could win at the Fair Japan. During the Japanese-Russia War, again, they brought in boats that they had on the lagoon, and they did these mock battles between 2 different kinds of boats using fireworks. During the Spanish-American War, on one of the islands, they built what they called a Cuban village, and they brought a family from Cuba. I'm not kidding. They brought this family from Cuba that had been exiled from the war. They had been driven out of Cuba because of the war. And they put them on this island. They built them a hut. They kind of developed a farm around them. And you could actually go out on a boat out to the island, and it was kind of like a living history exhibit. You could see how people in Cuba lived, supposedly. I kind of see these people as being on display in a kind of weird sort of way, but I guess if you're out of the war zone, you were grateful to be out of the war zone. They also had an oddity display on the Midway, so you could see all kinds of human oddities. You could see animal oddities. There was an article in the 1930s where they thought they had found a dead body at what was the lagoon, and they had discovered that it was just a preserved body that had been left over from the oddity display. When the park closed, they just demolished it. So they kept finding these things over the years that had been part of the lagoon. This was a ride developed in 1909. It was called the Automobile Aerial Road, and you'll see this on the map when Andy shows you the map. It was another big draw. It had 6 Buick, full-size Buick cars, so you'll see the Buick there on the road. It was on a track, and it went in a big Circle 8 that took over a good part of the park. And it's based on the rides that you see today. When you look at it, what's down the middle of the track? There's a metal rod. If you've ever gone to Kings Island and done the old, what do they call it, the Model A ride, where when you're driving you can't go off because there's that metal bar in the middle. Same technology in 1909. Full-size cars, however. The idea was you were riding through the treetops. So when you get down further, this thing went way up in the air. You were actually in the treetops when we were riding in these cars. And it was interesting in that many of the photographs show women driving and men sitting in the passenger seat. Because for women, it was a chance for them to actually drive a car where they wouldn't have typically gotten the chance out on the open road. Here's another view. The building behind right here is part of that Japanese fair, when you'll see it on the map. It was a very popular part of the park as well. There's one of those women. She's getting her independence. She's the woman, by the way, that shows up in about a half a dozen postcards. I don't know if she's J.J. Weaver's wife or who she is. J.J. Weaver was the manager for much of the time that the park was open. He developed much of the park property after the park closed. He was also the founder of one of Ludlow's oldest businesses, still in existence today. What business did J.J. Weaver start? Ideal Supply. Here's a picture from the air. So you'll see the scenic railway in the front. This is the dance hall. The dance hall could hold up to 1,000 dancers at one time on several different levels. This is the original theater building. You'll see in the background Deverell and Park Avenue, houses on Deverell and Park. Everything else west of that is still undeveloped land, all owned by the Lagoon Company and would later be developed by them. I live, by the way, when I get my tax bill, I live in the Ludlow Lagoon Land Edition. Another nice postcard view. You'll see that the Shoot the Chutes is still there in this particular view. In 1912, 1913, they built what's called a motor drome. It is an oval track, quarter mile. It's built at a 60-degree angle, and it's wood. So it's all built out of wood. Above the track are wooden stands for people to sit. It officially opened. It could seat 8,000, so it was a large oval, and you'll see it on the map when Andy shows it to you in a minute. Officially opened on July 21, 1913, and races were held 3 times per week, and admission was 50 cents. 1912, 50 cents was significant money. This was not a cheap event to go to. Here's a view of the track. If you look really closely, between the track and the stands, there is a wire mesh that ran all the way around, and what that was supposed to do was to keep any motorcycles that went off the track from going into the stands. Also along the edge are lights. See the lights? They did some of these races in the dark. Those lights were gas. They never changed them over to electric, which would be a big problem, as we'll see in a moment. July 1913, the same month it opens, there is a major accident. Odin Johnson from Salt Lake City, who was staying with a family on Park Avenue. His car, they believe one of his tires blew. He hit the wire mesh, and the wire mesh held. So that safety device worked. Unfortunately, though, the motorcycle knocked over one of the gas lamps and threw flaming oil into the crowd. There were several thousand people in the grandstand that evening. This is one of the depictions from the Kentucky Post, and you'll see it's basically the Grim Reaper. He's holding a fork full of deceased people, and you'll see the motorcycles around in the bowl. Can you see what the bottle says? Speed Madness. There were. This is the youngest victim. His name is Charles Davis Jr. He lived on Park Avenue. The report said that his mother was with him. His father worked on the railroad. And the story in the paper that was consistently told from the day after the tragedy, his father was coming into Ludlow. He was approaching the trestle. He got this weird sense that something was wrong. And he looked towards the lagoon and he saw a flash of light. He jumped off the engine, ran down to the lagoon. He knew his wife and son were there. Odin Johnson, the driver of the motorcycle, was staying with the family. How coincidental was that? He gets down to the track. His son is one of the first ones taken away. This little boy, unfortunately, was right in the line of fire and was burnt from head to toe. His mother did survive, but he died. There are stories of people basically being human torches, is what they call them in the paper. This is Charles Davis Jr.'s death certificate. You'll see his father's name was Charles Davis. His mother was Edna Hume. They were both from Covington. Charles was born in West Covington, and can you see what his occupation was? Schoolboy. His cause of death was motorcycle accident, extensive burns, gasoline explosion. He's buried in Highland Cemetery. He was buried there on August 1st. Many of the victims were taken to local homes. Others were taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital, which at that time was on 11th Street, 11th and Madison. If you know where Wadsworth Electric, the old Wadsworth Electric building is, at Madison and 11th, that used to be the site of St. Elizabeth Hospital. So many were taken through Devou Park to the hospital. We have the hospital records at the library. We have the original set. The handwritten records kept by the sisters who were working there, and they kept detailed records on everybody who came from this accident. And so most of the deaths occurred at St. Elizabeth. This is another ad or another newspaper article that ran in the Post. You'll see killed 10, injured 15. The injured rate actually went up much higher than 15, but 10 actually did die that we know of and that we can verify. The records were not really as well kept as one would think during this time period. I have searched and found 10 confirmed dead. Actually, the Motordrome was repaired and opened within 3 weeks, and they continued to race. Nobody would sit anywhere near the track, and eventually we'll see what happens to the track. This is a list of the deceased. There's a mother, a daughter, a husband and wife. Charles Davis, who is the youngest, he's the second one there. He's listed as 5. But it gives you information, and you probably can't see it from where you're sitting, but it tells you what they did, where they came from. Lima, Ohio, Carlisle, Kentucky, New York City, Covington, Cincinnati, Covington, Utah. So people were from all over the country were at the lagoon. And this, again, was a huge draw. They were having these kind of accidents throughout the country. And eventually the sport went out of business. 1913 also was the year of a flood, and there was great damage done to the park during the flood, but it did reopen in 1914. 1915 was the tornado year that swept through northern Kentucky. This is what was left of the Motordrome in 1915. It was not rebuilt. Much of the park was damaged by the 1915 tornado. The ads in the paper were, the roof's off at the lagoon, but we're still open. And so they kept going. Here's some more storm damage. That's the dance pavilion behind us, which was eventually repaired. The scenic railroad was also extensively damaged. All of this was rebuilt. This is, again, what was left of part of that Motordrome. It's interesting to think this tornado actually came from Indiana, came into northern Kentucky, hit Bromley, the lagoon, destroyed St. Boniface Church, went through Covington, Newport, Bellevue, Dayton, and into Ohio, and took out I don't know how many steeples. If you look at church histories in northern Kentucky along the river, almost every church in that area lost their steeple in 1915. By the way, Farrell's Pharmacy up here at the corner was built as the Masonic temple. If you look, it has this little stunted little steeple on it. It originally had a nice spire on it, which was destroyed by the 1915 tornado. The big thing happened, though, in 1917. What happened in American history in 1917? We went to war with Germany. In 1918, they decided to declare prohibition to save grain for the war effort. And so they quit producing beer. They said it was only going to be temporary, and actually it was, because prohibition, as we know it, didn't start till 1920. So for 1 year, they stopped the production of beer. What that meant for the Lagoon was no profits. Once there was no beer, there was no profits. So much money had been spent rebuilding the park from the flood, from the tornado, and the Motordrome accident, that in 1918 was basically the last year of operation. And beer did it in. What's left of the park was developed into a subdivision called the Lagoon Land Subdivision and the Lagoon Land Addition, which Andy will talk about in a minute. The streets that we're talking about, Park, Lake, Lagoon, also Stokesay, Deverell, and Ludford were part of that development. By the way, we're naming streets. Deverell, Stokesay, Ludford. Anybody know where they come from? Ludlow, England, which is the family homestead of the Ludlow family. There was a Ludford Bridge. I forget what Deverell is. The castle in the area is Stokesay. So all three of those names come from the area around the original Ludlow family estate in England. This is one building that's still left, the clubhouse. The clubhouse was the dining hall, basically. There were chefs brought in every summer, usually from New York or Chicago, to provide food for the guests. Common guests, everyday guests, ate on the midway. If you wanted fine dining or dancing and you didn't want to be with the rabble, so to speak, you went to the clubhouse. This is where you went dressed up. This is where you went out for a night of fine dining and dancing. The Royal Hungarian Orchestra actually played on the front lawn of the clubhouse. It was so famous. Framondi's band also, which was, he was one of the mentors of Sousa, you know, Mr. Sousa of great American band fame. Framondi played at the Lagoon many seasons as well. This building is at the corner of Deverell and Lake, where Lake wraps around. This was the original caretaker's house. So the caretaker who was in charge of keeping the grounds clear and clean, this was his family home. The upper picture is of one of the original caretakers, his wife, and their baby sitting on the front porch. And you'll see the front porch is remarkably the same. The only difference is they've cut out, that used to be on a much flatter land. When they built the subdivision, they cut out much of that area and brought down the level of the street. So that's where I finish. Any questions? Yes. What happened to the driver in the accident? He had a crushed skull. He was taken originally to the Davis house on Park Avenue. It was decided very quickly that he needed attention from a surgeon. He was taken to St. Elizabeth and died at St. Elizabeth. His wife was actually taken there as well. She was at the event. She was not injured. She eventually, she stayed at the hospital actually for 2 days. They could not get her out of the hospital. She was so distraught. They put her in a room for 2 days and sedated her for 2 days. But the driver died within about 5 hours. He did not last very long. The only thing they wore for protection were leather helmets, similar to what maybe a football player of that era would have worn. So the head was particularly vulnerable in those kind of accidents.